What's going on, friends? Lauren Sisler here with AL.com. Got our SEC insider Matt Zenitz here to talk some Alabama football. And we're talking Tua Tagovailoa, obviously coming off the tightrope surgery on the ankle. He did end up playing against LSU. Got a little banged up, obviously was limping off the field we saw there at the end of the football game. What do you know about sort of his overall health and his status coming off that game, considering he obviously had to go out there and sort of fight it out for 4 quarters against a very physical LSU football team?
Well, two things. There are two aspects of this for me. First of all, fortunately for Alabama, Tua didn't do any further damage to the ankle playing against LSU.
Very good.
Everything that I've heard, including what Coach Saban said on Monday, was positive regarding the status of Tua's ankle. So Tua did not practice on Monday, but it was just kind of a strategic move for him, just holding him out. And I guess it'll be just a day-to-day evaluation with him moving forward throughout the course of the week. But once again, he did not do any further damage to the ankle against LSU. The second part of this, Saturday was just further proof, further confirmation for me just of what kind of competitor Tua is.
Doubt.
So we've seen
Absolutely.
the competitiveness before, but I mean, really more so than most people probably realize, showed a tremendous amount of resolve, mettle, determination throughout the course of that game, because at one point had an LSU defensive lineman fall on his ankle. There were times obviously got hit during the course of the game, and I think anybody who was watching that game closely, which I would assume most people who are watching this were probably watching it closely, saw probably as the game progressed that the Tua was limping some, was clearly in discomfort. It was something people from the Alabama side noticed also, to the point that there was actually a consideration during the second half of maybe even pulling him from the game. So Mac Jones warmed up at one point, and from everything that I've heard, Tua just didn't want to come out of the game. So even though that may have been a consideration for people on the staff, Tua, from everything I've heard, once again, wanted to stay in that game, was determined to finish out that game, and wanted to do everything possible, regardless of being in pain, regardless of being limited, to try to help Alabama overcome that deficit and try to win the game. It was really impressive.
Yeah, and I would say going along with that, going into that matchup, I said it all along. I said there's no chance Tua doesn't play in this. And even if he is whatever percentage he is going to, and I hate to say inflate that number, but he is going to give the indication, because he is so tough and resilient. So, his pain scale and his meter might be a lot different than maybe us average folk here, Us has-been athletes, right?
And I'll say this also. So Tua, but by no means was that a normal Tua performance. There were a couple of mistakes during the course of the game that just were uncharacteristic of what you typically see from Tua. But at the same time, think about what he did. So Tua, at less than 100%, went out there against LSU, consistently one of the better defenses in the country, and at less than 100%, and once again, clearly limited, especially throughout the course of the second half, goes out there and finishes with 418 yards and 4 touchdowns against LSU.
I know, and nobody's talking about those 418 yards. Everything's kind of like being obviously reflected on Joe Burrow and his performance. And, credit to him, obviously. But for Tua to be able to do that, obviously have the performance he did, and not to mention, not only is he having to, run this offense against LSU, he's having to also think about protecting that ankle. And I feel like, obviously, he did the best that he could in doing so. But LSU was after him. And, I mean, they wanted to get pressure on him. They wanted to make him run that ball. They wanted to get him uncomfortable. And, obviously, they did a good job of that. But, yeah, to your point, holding their own. So that just brings us to the final topic of conversation here. For Alabama to obviously perform the way they did, coming out of the half and obviously going into the second half and being able to sort of put up what you would call some resilient numbers and being able to fight back. How does that bode for them in terms of, in the eyes of the playoff committee, as we sort of venture into the back half of the season and get close to the college football playoff and what those final rankings are going to end up looking like?
I think they still have a great chance of getting in. So I'm not a bettor by any means. I think Stacey would probably be mad at me if I was making bets at this point. But if I were betting, I would actually go as far as to bet on them still getting in over the teams that they're going to be in competition with for that last spot. So it's fair to say, obviously, at this point, that Ohio State, LSU, Clemson, if they win out, which they probably will, that they're in the playoffs. But it's very much up in the air when it comes to that number 4 spot. So you have Alabama, you have Georgia, you have Oklahoma, you have whoever the Pac-12 champ ends up being, who are the primary teams who are going to be in the mix for that number 4 spot. And when you look at it just from a resume standpoint, Alabama is going to have a decent chance of getting in. So if you look at it starting with Georgia first of all, has a really tough test this week with Auburn. Even if they get through the Auburn game with a win, they still play Texas A&M, and if they get through that without losing to either Auburn or Texas A&M, still would face probably LSU in the SEC championship game. At some point, you have to think there's probably a decent chance that Georgia loses one of those games, and if they lose one of those games, they're out of the mix when it comes to a playoff spot.
They need LSU to win the SEC championship.
Yep, absolutely. Oklahoma then. Oklahoma has an interesting game this week with Baylor. Has a couple more tests the rest of the way, play a top 25 team in Oklahoma State, and then would play, I think it's either Baylor or Texas in the Big 12 championship game. But Oklahoma, even if they win out, they have a couple games that are going to very much work against them when it comes time for the committee to make a decision. So Oklahoma lost to an unranked Kansas State team in a game that Oklahoma only lost by 7, but if you look at it, the beginning part of the fourth quarter, Oklahoma was down by 25 in that game to an unranked team. That's going to hurt them. So is what happened on Saturday. So Oklahoma wins on Saturday, but they only win by 1 against an unranked Iowa State team. You know how important style points are, and not a lot of style points when it comes to only beating Iowa State by 1. And then you have the Pac-12 situation. So Oregon, I would say, is probably the most likely team to come out of the Pac-12 and to win the conference championship there. But Oregon at this point has no wins against current top 25 teams. I don't think faces any top 25 teams the rest of the regular season, and they have a loss. And who did they lose to? They lost to Auburn. So that could end up being interesting for Alabama because you have a common opponent there. If Alabama goes out and takes care of business against Auburn the last game of the regular season, if you're looking at them against Oregon, that would very much work in Alabama's favor, having the common opponent, Oregon having a loss against that common opponent, Alabama having a win. Obviously, things become even more interesting if teams like Minnesota, Baylor remain undefeated. If Penn State goes out and beats Ohio State, they're very much in the mix for a playoff spot at that point. I just don't see any of those three things happening. Minnesota, Baylor staying undefeated, or Penn State beating Ohio State, which is why, getting back to my original point, I think Alabama has such a good chance of still getting in regardless of losing the game on Saturday.
All right, he's Matt Zenitz. Thank you so much for all the insight. We appreciate it as always, and you can visit us for all your Crimson Tide updates on AL.